Welcome everybody to the Bassfug podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Alex Banks. I'm not sure are you in Thailand right now?
No, I'm in Brighton at the moment.
Brighton. Okay. Welcome to the show, Alex. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's good to be here.
Okay.
Just to say, I do kind of wish I was in Thailand. For those listening, maybe at a later date, we're actually in the midst of a worldwide pandemic at the moment, and most people are kind of stuck in their current locations. Brighton, in my house, is a nice place to be. I'm looking out across the seafront at the moment, where my house looks out onto the sun shining. However, if I did find myself stuck on a Thailand island somewhere in the South Pacific or the a sea near Asia, then I wouldn't have a problem with that. But yeah, we're all good.
How are you holding up during quarantine? Have you been making more music, or have you been just playing Animal Crossing or something?
I'm doing pretty well, actually. I mean, obviously, these are pretty crazy times, and they're affecting a lot of different people in different ways. I've generally found for a lot of music producers, life hasn't really changed that much. Spending vast amounts of time by yourself in some kind of studio or in front of some kind of workstation is kind of what we do anyway. So it's not hugely different. Obviously, I'm missing going out and seeing my friends. I'm missing being able to go out to clubs and go to live music and go to bars and restaurants and everything else. And obviously there's some really dark stuff happening out there, and a lot of people getting very sick and dying, which is obviously incredibly sad. But personally, I'm okay. I'm getting a lot of music done. I've been working from home a lot the last couple of months because we're not really supposed to be going out. Well, up until recently, we're supposed to be working from home where possible. And I found that's actually been really good for some kind of tasks. Like, I took a minimal studio setup home from the studio back home, and it's quite fun sometimes to limit yourself to certain pieces of equipment. So when I'm in the studio, I've got tons of gear around me, and I use all sorts of tools. It's actually quite fun sometimes to take yourself into a different location and just be like, right, I'm just going to use these few bits of gear and see what I come out with. So I found this really good for sketching out ideas and getting kind of rough stuff going, but I found it really difficult to actually finish anything working from home. So the last week I've been going back into the studio and remembering how much I enjoy sitting in front of a big pair of speakers with the sub and actually feeling proper bass when you're working on a track. So yeah, it's been quite an interesting process. It's quite productive.
So why were you having problems finishing? Because of the speaker setup?
I don't know. It's a good question, and it's. I mean, I've done. You asked me at the start if I was in Thailand. I'm sure you've probably seen on my social media that I go there sometimes, and I've been to. Last year I was in Lanzarote for 2 months in the Canary Islands, and I was working remotely there, and it's something I choose to do sometimes, go to different places with a minimal setup and work there. But I've kind of found that in all the places that I am, it's there's just something about being in the studio in your kind of comfort zone and your sort of surroundings where you know the speakers, what the room kind of feels like, and you're there by yourself in your zone, and there's it somehow feels more proper. That's not even correct English, but there's just something hard to explain where you just feel like, right, I feel completely in control. I'm completely comfortable with what I'm doing here, and I feel more capable of making the best production decisions when I'm in that environment. When I take myself out of that environment, I sometimes come out with possibly more interesting creative decisions and come out with melodies maybe and sound design that I wouldn't normally do perhaps in the studio, because I'm using different tools, I'm using limited tools, and it makes me think in a slightly different way. But in terms of kind of trusting that I'm making the right decision to actually finish a track, somehow it just doesn't work so well when I'm not in the studio.
It's funny that you say that, because I was reading a study a couple of months ago, and they're talking about why people are productive when they bring their laptops to to coffee shops, and they did a
Okay.
bunch of MRIs on people and stuff like that. And apparently, when your brain reacts to novelty in this weird survival instinct thing. So if you're in an environment that you aren't usually in, like your brain kind of works a little bit more, and there's different synapses or whatever, however that works. So what you're explaining,
cool.
is very, very. It sounds very familiar. You know?
Yeah, that kind of supports that evidence, I think. So it feels like, you know, I'm getting stuff done the best I can with the tools that are available to me, and it might make me think in a different way. But yeah, I guess I'm not as relaxed and I'm not as comfortable. And also I've got distractions. I've got 2 Bengal cats here that are quite demanding. One of them is quite new. And you know, if they're in the room and they're wanting my attention, I don't get to work for very long before one of them jumps on top of a synthesizer and starts trying to eat the controls or something like that.
Oh,
which,
wow.
Is not conducive to getting tracks finished.
Do they go after your gear a lot? Do you find like cat puke on like your synths?
No, thankfully no cat puke. I'm pleased to say it's more kind of. I think they're interested in the tactile nature of the knobs and the controls and the switches, so they might go over and kind of from curiosity start kind of chewing on one of the knobs, and when they see my reaction, how quickly I try and remove them from the synthesizer, then they realize that's a really fun game to play and that they should try and play more of it. So if in theory, if I was to sit back and watch them eat my drum machine or eat my synthesizer, then it might not inspire them so much to come back and do that, but it's pretty hard to sit and watch that and let them get on with it, so I tend not to.
Before we go into sort of like the history of how you got into music, I kind of want to talk about your gear and your studio. It sounds like you got a lot of stuff, and I'm sure some of the listeners would be really interested. Can you just give us an overview of what you have right now and maybe what is in your minimal setup when you travel?
Sure. I mean, it's going to take quite a long time to list everything because I've been collecting a lot of it for quite a few years now. But I guess the setup is based around a Allen & Heath GSR 24 desk, like 24 track desk. It's got like a sound card built into it, so it kind of acts as a hybrid analog digital setup. And I love working like that. It means that all of my gear can be connected to the desk and to various patch bays that are all kind of plumbed in. So I've got this nice analog vibe going, but it's also kind of plumbed straight into the computer so that if I want to record something, everything's connected all at the same time. So the EQs on it are really nice, and it just feels really nice to have a proper mixing desk in front of me. I mean, technically I probably don't have to have it, but I really like the feel of it. So that's kind of the hub of it. I'm using Logic and Ableton kind of 50-50 in the studio. I'll talk more about the processes later as to what I'm using them for. But that's sort of the hub of it. And then I've got loads of analog gear. I've got my Moog Voyager, which is the first proper sort of big analog synth that I bought probably about 8 years ago. I think that's kind of when my synth addiction started. I've got a Roland Juno 106, got a SH101, Korg MS10, Prophet 6. I've got an old Yamaha CS1X, like old synth from back in the 90s. I've got a Moog Mother 32, a couple of Korg Volcas from the series. I've got what else is in there? Got some Eurorack stuff last year. Got like a Q-Pass filter by Make Noise and a few of the Mutable Instruments bits, and a granular looper and some other bits and pieces. I haven't delved too far into the modular world yet, but I've just got like a little unit to kind of get me started, which I also use for my live setup. Then I've got a Roland SEO2, I've got a Big Sky Reverb, got a couple of vintage Yuri 1178 compressors, which are basically stereo 1176s. APR 2500 compressor. I've got a classic Neve channel, which I love using, which is like an EQ and preamp. Alesis 3630 compressor, TL audio compressor, and some Adam A77X monitors, and a sub, I think it's a sub 10 or sub 12, one of their sub units. Yeah, that's kind of the main bulk of it, and then various guitars, a couple of Neumann mics, a few other bits and pieces. But it's never enough.
Yeah, you seem pretty set up.
I'm still looking for more. In fact, I just ordered a Moog DFAM yesterday, I don't know if you've seen them. They're kind of little. It's like a sort of analog mono synth, but it's designed as a drum synthesizer primarily. But it's for kind of creating weird sounds. I've actually got a Vermona DRM1, which I didn't mention, which is also really good for creating strange sounds. But I mean, my gear addiction isn't just from the kind of. I don't just sort of buy the stuff for the sake of it to collect it. Like I know a lot of people that buy synths and they don't even really make much music. They just love having the synths, which is totally cool. But I find that buying new equipment is such a huge source of inspiration, and I make so much music all the time, not just as Alex Banks as an artist. I do a lot of freelance work as well for my publisher NinjaTune, writing stuff for their kind of catalogue and writing stuff for kind of film and TV here and there. And so I've got so much output that I kind of need new toys to inspire me. And it's that thing of being a kid. Like I remember when I was a kid and I started making music, having new instruments and new things to play with just gives you that kind of innocence of like, let's just get stuck in and see what this does and see what kind of sounds we can make with it. And I find it really important to have new sounds and to have new equipment to make me think in different ways and just come out with stuff that I haven't already done, because that's a really important part, I think, of being an artist, is to feel like you're always exploring something new. That said, I love having things like the Voyager and the Juno and the SH-101 because they're synths that I've had for years, and I feel like the way I've approached those synths and the way I've used them in my tracks has kind of become part of my sound, and they're like old friends. You know, I know that if I go to the Voyager, I can make a really cool bass line on it because I've done it 100 times, but it's quite a deep synth, so there's always a new angle that I can kind of take on it, and my sound design skills continue to get better and better, so I'm always going to find something new and interesting that I can do with that. Maybe not as exciting as a brand new bit of kit that I've just bought, but it's nice to have that familiarity, I think, of having certain instruments that you maybe use on a few different records that kind of give you a coherence to your sound, but also mix that with having new approaches and new equipment and software as well. You know, lots of amazing plugins coming out all the time, and just keeping you inspired that way to kind of keep things fresh.
Do you prefer one over the other, like a VST over hardware, or are you one of these guys that's just like, how's that work out for you?
I guess, I mean, they're fantastic for what they do in their own right. I know there's a lot of analog purists out there, or hardware purists, who, you know, they'll try and avoid using a computer entirely if they can, and there's other people out there who pretty much don't use outboard and they just make everything in the box, and they're making amazing records too. For me personally, I love both sides of it. I love having the hardware because I feel that as a musician who plays guitar, piano and drums and other instruments before I even got into production, having the hardware makes it feel more like a performance, and I feel like it captures more of a vibe in the studio, even if it's just me in the studio by myself. If I've got the speakers cranked up and I can jam on a synth and mess around with the controls, then I feel like I'm performing something and I'm capturing something. Whereas if I try and write something just using plugins, then whilst it can still sound fantastic, and maybe in terms of the sonic qualities, the plugins are so good now that it's getting really difficult to tell the difference. But from a performance aspect, I definitely feel that having the hardware changes the way I approach it, and it's a lot more fun for me. However, on the flip side, the software is fantastic for capturing those sounds and editing them and doing something much more interesting in the edit than if I just used the recording by itself. And I think in some ways having such almost limitless potential for editing and sound design within the software means that you can concentrate on having fun in the performance aspect of the recording, like, you know, with the synths and the hardware. You just concentrate on having fun and jamming ideas and getting some vibe going, and then capturing that, and then using the amazing potential of the software to turn that into something completely different if you want to. I mean, I actually find on the last couple of albums that I've done, quite a lot of the tracks have started off pretty average, to be honest. They start off with me having some fun composing something, and usually being initially excited by it, and then maybe after a few sessions or after a bit of time has passed, coming back thinking like, yeah, that's kind of cool, but that's not as interesting as it could be. And then often taking what I'd recorded and almost remixing my own track before it ever even existed to be able to be remixed by someone else. It's like I'm taking those ideas, remixing it into something else, and then coming up with something usually that sounds a lot fresher. So yeah, I guess to answer the question, you know, both the hardware side and the digital side, the software do amazing things, and I just see them all as instruments and tools at my disposal to make music with.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. You're it's a feel, you know. There's something. It's not that the VSTs, my personal opinion on it, it's not that the VSTs are bad or wrong. It's just, you know, your Moog Voyager has one power button and then it just turns on and then it's all in front of you. Yeah. You know, when you get the VSTs, it's like you're playing a video game or something, which isn't bad, but sometimes you're in the mood for it and sometimes you aren't, you know?
Yeah, totally. I've got a little Doppler Dark Time analog sequencer. Actually, no, I think it might be digital, but it looks analog, but it's a hardware thing. And I was actually writing a synth line on it yesterday, and I was actually trying to explain to my girlfriend, who's a pianist and a very talented one, why somebody like me would want to make a melody on a piece of equipment where you are programming the notes with knobs and switches. Yeah. It's like, yeah, I can play the keyboards, but there's something about kind of going to a bit of kit that's got, you know, flashing lights on it and knobs, and you're not thinking about chords or where your hand would fall or going to any of the sort of predictable things. It's like you're just using your ears and you're using your brain in a really different way. And yeah, I love switching up the approach with things like that.
You were talking about remixes. Did you want to touch on Beneath the Surface, your latest remixed album?
Sure. Yeah. So
how did that come about?
I guess. Well, having finished the album last year and it being released on Max Cooper's Mesh label, like there's so much kind of depth to the music that I made on there. There's so many layers and so many textures that I thought it'd be cool to get some remixes done. And also in the sort of 2 or 3 years between releasing Illuminate. Actually, Illuminate, my previous album that came out in 2014, I think, so there was quite a big gap between them. But after they came out, I did tons of remixes for other people and made some really good connections, partly from touring and kind of being out and about and doing shows for people and people getting in touch and doing some remixes for them. And so I guess I wanted to use this as an opportunity, having finished an album, to touch on some of the amazingly talented producers that I've come in contact with and get them to kind of return the favour and do a remix for me. So and it's really nice how it's come together. I really love the organic feel of it, how like everybody on there is somebody that I know and I'm personal friends with, and there's some kind of story behind the connections there. And it's really, really interesting to hear how the music's come together, because obviously I've spent so much time making the album. I think it took about 2.5 years, and you get so attached to every single part in there and to every single track in terms of the way it's composed and all the detail you put into it. And it's really interesting to hear other like-minded producers take elements of those tracks and turn them into something completely different, but still with some kind of coherence, because I don't know how it's coherent really, I guess because the music they're remixing has all come from me in the first place, but I think it hangs together really well as a package. Both the remix EPs do. So we did Beneath the Surface remixed part 1 that came out I think 2 or 3 months ago, and then we did the second part, just came out about a week and a half ago now. So yeah, it's been really cool. And then to top it off, we had a remix from Max Cooper himself on that last package. He remixed a track called Spiraling off the album. And that was quite a nice completion of that journey, because obviously releasing the album on his label and then the remix EPs, and then the last track that comes out is Max's remix. So that kind of rounds things off quite nicely, I think. Cool.
So can you, I want to talk about how you got onto Mesh, but I think it might be a better idea just to start from the beginning. This is usually a thing that we do around here because it's nice to see the progression, you know, because you see where you're at now, and someone who's new to producing will be like, oh, there's no way I'm going to get a Juno 106, and there's no way I'm going to be publishing music for film or TV. So can you give us like sort of the outline of like, how did you get into music? Were you always into music when you were a kid, or?
Yeah. I mean, it's a long story. I'm going to try not to fill up the next half an hour or whatever with the entire life story of my music history. But yeah, people often ask like, when did you get into music? And it really, I think it's just something that you I don't know, you're just into it. And I never really thought that I'd do anything else apart from maybe when I was really young and I wanted to be a racing driver or a footballer or something. But like my older brother, who's 6 years older, he played guitar. My dad played a little bit of guitar, just played a few chords. So there were guitars around the house and there was music around the house, and we had a piano, and I was just really keen to kind of get involved. I just was really into music as a kid. So when I was 10 years old, I started learning guitar, drums and piano. Started having lessons in all three of those, and I was really into rock music. I was listening to lots of like Guns N' Roses and Metallica and that kind of stuff. And guitar, most of all, is probably the instrument that developed quickest, and I would spend hours every day practicing like Steve Vai solos and then Megadeth and Dream Theater and stuff like that. But I was also listening to a band called Osric Tentacles that my brother also introduced me to, and they were this kind of weird like hippie psychedelic band from like the West Country in the UK, and it was like screaming guitar solos and kind of progressive rock, but with like really cool synth sounds and really interesting synth textures. And that, I think, was the first point my ears kind of started opening to like electronic sounds. And then in the mid-90s, when I was 15, you started getting like Chemical Brothers coming out and Prodigy and Orbital, and the whole scene just kind of exploded, and like the rave scene was kicking off in the UK, and there was just so much exciting electronic music coming out at the time. And I felt like in a couple of years before I really got into it, like I remember when the Prodigy's first album came out and some kids at school were into it, and I was interested, but it was it felt like such a distant leap from like the guitar-based rock I've been listening to this kind of like weird sounding like electronic stuff that it took me a little while to get it. But then it was actually seeing Orbital on stage on TV at Glastonbury back in, I think it was 94, they did this like legendary performance. And something really clicked for me then, like seeing these guys on stage with all these synthesizers, but they were on a stage at what traditionally had been kind of a rock festival or like a live music festival. And all of a sudden I could see how electronic music could exist in a format where traditionally you'd only really see bands play before that. And then I think the next year was my first Glastonbury I went to in real life, and the Prodigy were performing there, they were headlining it, and all of a sudden you had this crossover where electronic music wasn't just for the clubs anymore, it was also for the stage and for the festivals, and people were making songs, like you had Lamb and Portishead and Faithless and all these electronic acts kind of coming out, recording songs and making very composition based electronic music that also has this kind of live feel about it. So that for me at the time was hugely inspiring. So I was still learning my instruments, I was still practicing loads of guitar, and I started to study jazz guitar, and I moved to London when I was 17 to further that. And but I was also got my first synthesizer, and I got a sampler, and started to kind of learn how to make electronic music.
What was your first synth?
It was the Yamaha CS1X that I mentioned earlier. I got that in 95, I think, for my 15th birthday. And at the time, it was quite revolutionary because it was the first synth that had come out for years that had a cut-off knob on it. Because, as you probably know, in the like 70s, you had all these analog synths coming out that had all the controls on it. And then when we went into the 80s, they decided to make synthesizers with like really minimal design. So you only had a few sliders on there, and if you wanted to control the cutoff on like an old Ensoniq or something, then you had to dive into some menu, press lots of buttons, find the cutoff control, and then like scroll up or down, which is not particularly conducive to making weird wild filter sweeps. So when this synth came out, it was like one of the first kind of digital synths that had some kind of analog control on it. So yeah, I mean, that was hugely exciting at the time. So yeah, I moved to London and started trying to make some pretty basic sounding electronic music that I guess was like Chemical Brothers, Prodigy sort of influenced, and a bit sort of techno influenced as well. And then I was playing jazz in like bars and restaurants and little clubs, to just kind of make a bit of a living, just a bit of cash to kind of get by, and to buy other little bits of studio equipment. And then I feel like I kind of reached a point where I felt like the music industry had become this impenetrable sort of being that I couldn't really get into. Like, I didn't have any connections in electronic music. I didn't know anyone who worked for any record labels or anything like that, and I didn't really know how to get into it. And so when I was 20, I decided to go to Brunel University. Sorry, I'd been to Brunel to do my diploma. Decided to go to University of Westminster to do the commercial music BA honours degree. And it wasn't necessarily that I felt I needed to go and learn, because I mean I did, but at the same time, like, I was very good at teaching myself, and I'd by this point got, I think, one of the first proper versions of Cubase that could record audio, and was getting into that side of things. But it's more really to like make connections and kind of feel like I was part of something. So I did this 3-year degree course there, which was fantastic, and that actually, whilst I didn't necessarily learn much hands-on production from the teachers there. They were there to advise, but kind of learned that if you're going to go and study music, a lot of people say, well, I don't need someone to teach me music. These are my ideas, and I don't need someone to tell me what the ideas are, and so forth. And true, like, even like nowadays, you can go on YouTube and you can kind of teach yourself almost anything. But actually, I found that having the structure of going to university every day and meeting people and being around other people who are all also kind of pursuing this goal of getting into the music industry and learning more about their craft, I found that hugely inspiring. And most importantly, I guess, some years later, probably sort of 2 or 3 years after I left uni, all of these people that I've been studying with all went off into different parts of the industry, getting jobs at labels and publishers and sync companies and whatever. And they'd my first kind of break into, I guess, going along the line of being a professional music producer was somebody calling up saying, "Hey man, I'm working for a advertising agency in their music department now. We're looking for a track that sounds a bit like this or this. Have you got anything, or do you want to make something?" So I stayed up all night, made him a track that was not my usual style, but yeah, it was kind of electronic-y, I guess, but like a bit sort of poppy, and they absolutely loved it. They're like, wow, this is amazing. I mean, it didn't end up getting used for that particular job, but then they started giving me bits of work. And somebody else I went to uni with, he started working for a massive music publisher, and they were putting out a lot of library music, and he said, "Oh, you know, we're putting some libraries together. Do you want to make some electronica style tracks?" And those were my first paid gigs, really, as a producer. And yeah, they came around from people that I met at uni who I'd stayed in touch with, and it kind of opened up opportunities. And then lots of other stories of people that went to work for management companies and worked for other labels and so forth. And if I think back to all the connections that I now have in the industry, they all stem back from people that I met as part of a network, just having a coffee in the bar at uni, or having a pint or whatever. So yeah, that was really important for me. And I wouldn't necessarily say that you have to go to university to get that, because now where I live in Brighton, I feel like there's a really nice network and a really nice community here. And I'm sure other places in the world, like, you don't necessarily have to kind of go to a university to do that. But I guess I learned that being part of a network is hugely important in trying to make a career in music. And I mean, back then, this was like 2001 that I went to university. The internet was really very much in its infancy. Like, most people didn't have it at home, but now, you know, you can make amazing connections online without meeting people face to face. But so yeah, it's kind of a long story, I guess, but like that was my first sort of transition from just being a bit of a bedroom producer to actually having some connections and starting to do some work for some publishing companies.
And you take yourself, like you're saying, more seriously when you go to school for it. Whereas if you're learning something on YouTube, you know, all you need is one video game recommendation, and then your whole day is gone. You know, like you're watching some video on Cubase, and then on the right side you see TikTok compilation, and then that's it. When you're at university, you're all in, and then you have the networking. And I think people forget that the networking is so important in music, because that's how you play shows, that's how you meet other people, that's how you meet mentors, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I must admit that's the part of this lockdown I'm really missing, is I'm not touring at the moment, and you know, touring is fantastic for making connections. Like I said, with these remixes, a lot of them I've met through touring, from being in Berlin and visiting other countries. But yeah, I mean, with university, it's also the discipline as well. You know, having deadlines and having to get your music finished by a certain date, even if you've got to stay up all night every night for a week and drinking tons of coffee just to kind of get through. Like it teaches you what it's like to have a deadline that you cannot miss. And I've never missed a single deadline with all the freelance work that I do. I always make sure that, you know, something is there in time. And I think it also teaches you that whilst you've always got to try your best. Like, I mean, I've always been very perfectionist about my production, and still am, but I've kind of learned that when you're working to a deadline for a client and you're trying to get stuff done, you're not always going to be able to deliver the most amazing polished production that you've ever done, because you haven't got time. Like, sometimes you've got 2 days to make a whole track, but what you're giving them is probably 75% of your best, but actually your 75% is still damn good, and it may well be good enough to win you the gig, and it's certainly better than not delivering anything at all on time because you're being too perfectionist about it. So I think that's something else that I learned through study, is like, well, you've got a deadline, and if you don't miss it, you're not going to pass. So sorry, if you don't make the deadline, you're not going to pass. So
it's like Mark Zuckerberg says at Facebook, the office has on the wall, it's a big painting, and it says "Ship before it's perfect."
Really? Okay.
Yeah, that's their motto, I guess.
Yeah, I can relate to that. So I guess just to sort of continue the story, like after uni, I was working on an album which never really got released. I kind of did a sort of self-release on it under a different alias, but I got a little publishing deal off it with a company based in Brighton, and I decided to move to Brighton after going back to the countryside for a couple of years, and started a new life down here. And I was actually out for beers one night, and made a whole nother album with, you know, just sort of for fun really, whilst doing bits of freelance work. And then one night I was out for beers and met a guy that I went to uni with, and he said, "Oh, well, look, I'm working for this guy now who's a music manager. Maybe you should have a chat with him and show him some of your music," which I did. And he said, "Well, which labels, publishers would you be interested in?" I said, "Well, Ninja Tune have obviously always been like one of my ideal labels to be involved with," and he had some connections there, and that led to me doing a remix for Bonobo, who is one of my biggest influences, certainly at the time, with the kind of sound I was making back then. So someone saying like, "Yeah, do you want to remix one of your favorite artists?" Like, I was like, "Well, hell yeah!" So I spent a month just working on this one remix, and just like really sweating it, a bit like it was a university project in some ways, and did this mix, and it luckily for me did incredibly well. It was really well received, and I then did another remix for Andrea Triana solo stuff after that, and so the label were really interested in working with me, so they gave me a publishing deal off the back of that, and then I was doing a gig in Zurich at Lethargy Festival, and it's just one of those nights. It was actually from doing a DJ mix for Ninja Tune's Solid Still series. They got in contact out of the blue, said, "Oh, look, we've had a cancellation. We really need somebody to play on the Saturday night at this festival. Are you up for it?" And it was the first international DJ gig that I'd done. So I was super excited about it. Went over and funnily enough, spent the evening hanging out with a producer called Italtech, who lives in Brighton. In fact, he lived just around the corner from my studio, but we'd never actually met. So we went all this way to another country to do a gig together to meet when we realised that we actually lived just around the corner. And also met this guy, Carsten, whose producer name is Phono, and he was releasing on 50 Weapons, which is Monkeytown Records' sister label, which is now defunct. But so yeah, I played him some of the... sent him some of the tracks after we'd met at this night, and yeah, out of the blue he was like, mate, these tunes are wicked, do you mind if I send them to Modeselektor, see if they want to release them on Monkeytown? So yeah, after a few emails back and forth, Modeselektor got in touch, said, how about you come over to Berlin, let's have a chat. And soon after I signed to Monkeytown to release Illuminate, and again, a bit like the Bonobo thing, it's like, this is a dream come true. You know, I booked tickets to go and see Moderat play at Coco in London. By the time the gig actually came around, I was having dinner with a guy signing a record deal backstage. It's like,
that's crazy.
You can't make this up. Yeah, it's nuts. It's nuts. So yeah, that was cool, and I got to tour with Moderat a bit, and made some really good connections in Berlin, and made a lot of fans across Europe, sort of from the Monkeytown connection, which was really cool. And then after a couple of years of touring and remixing, I decided it was time to start working on another album. And so that's kind of where the journey for Beneath the Surface began, really. I bought a ton of studio gear, bought the mixing desk that I mentioned earlier, and just kind of rejigged my whole setup so that my studio kind of felt new and exciting again, because like making Illuminate was such an intense process, as actually making all albums are. And I've been going to the studio every day and had all these late nights and really kind of burnt myself out trying to finish that record. So I wanted to make sure when I was starting a new record that I felt energized and enthusiastic, and kind of change the space up so that the space I was going to be working in and the equipment I was going to be using also felt fresh and new. So yeah, I've started working on Beneath the Surface, sketching out ideas, and it's actually a mutual friend I sent some tracks to, again a bit like the Monkeytown connection. He passed them on to Max Cooper, and Max and I had actually known each other for quite a few years, just not particularly well, but like we've met at a couple of gigs before, and we did a collaboration on a track called Eve, which he released as a free download a few years ago. So we kind of been in touch, and I knew that he'd been quite into some of the tracks on Illuminate, and yeah, funny timing wise, really, I'd just been playing a gig at Printworks in London. It's a Ninja Tune Monkeytown sort of showcase night, with artists from each label playing there. And I played out some of the tracks off the new album that nobody had heard yet, and finished the show and went back to the hotel room afterwards. I was super inspired, having just heard some of these tracks played out for the first time in this like big dark sort of warehouse style venue. I was thinking like, man, I can't wait for these tracks to come out. Logged into Facebook, and there was a message from Max Cooper there saying, hey man, how you doing? You know, I heard from a mutual friend of ours, Guy, that there's you got some tracks on the go for a new album. Do you think you might be interested in releasing them on Mesh? So yeah, it's really interesting synchronicity, the way these things just sort of work out. So
that's crazy.
So yeah, that was cool. Finished off the record, and that came out last year. So yeah, and quite a few people have asked, sort of, you know, how come you sort of ended up with releasing on Mesh? It's a really good fit, and it's really nice that these things happen organically. And I mean, I've sent stuff to tons of labels in the past, and they've, I don't know if they've listened to my stuff or they just listened to it and they weren't into it, but it is quite disheartening when producers send their stuff, or any artist sends their work to labels and they don't get a response. But I guess my advice to anyone listening is kind of don't be so disheartened by that. Despite the stories I've just told you, it's still quite unusual, I think, these days for someone to send in a bunch of tracks to a label, particularly if you're an unknown artist without a following, and for a label to just pick it up and run with it and say, cool, we're going to release an album, we're going to pay for pressing, we're going to pay for promotion and everything. I think the process, like, I've been very lucky with that, but the process is can happen in so many different ways. And I think these days, building your own fan base, getting your tracks up on SoundCloud or like any way that you can, and trying to organically generate some interest is a really good way of kind of beginning the journey towards getting tracks signed, or maybe starting with smaller labels that perhaps only have a few hundred followers, but just getting stuff out there and kind of getting your name known, so that when you go to one of the bigger labels, they're not just looking at a blank canvas that's going to require a lot of work from their point of view to kind of establish. They can see that you've already been working hard, you've already got a bit of a following, you've already shown that you're kind of determined to work on it. And I think these days labels are much more likely to kind of pick you up and work with you if you've already done some of the groundwork.
Yeah.
And you know, it's not like, that's not my favorite part of this job of being an artist. Like, obviously the bit that really inspires me is being in the studio making amazing tunes, but at the same time, I kind of love the fact that you don't just have to put it in fate's hands anymore to get your music out. Like, because back in the day when I was at uni, like, you couldn't just publish your tracks yourself on the internet. The only way you could give your track to people is by burning off a CD and giving it to someone physically, or posting it to them. So, you know, I love the fact that now you can take things into your own hands, and if your music is amazing, and people connect with it, then you can get that connection kind of pretty much straight away, and you can start to build that yourself. Yeah, not sure really what the point was to that, but
no, I was asking about your history, and you gave some solid, valuable advice there. I think just being in the right place at the right time and networking is so important. I know with my own personal journey, I was the same. I was sending demos to labels, and they were just throwing it on the pile, you know. But I'd meet someone for 5 minutes at a bar over a beer, and it's like, oh, you seem pretty cool. You want to do this or you want to do that? It's definitely about getting out there and making contacts and talking to people. And it doesn't and it doesn't have to be in a salesman kind of way either. It's just like in a legitimate mutual respect sort of way.
That's what I was about to say, man. That's so important, I think. I mean, I've had messages from people online, not too many thankfully, but kind of really quite intense messages where people somehow feel like somehow I owe them, I'm obligated to try and help them somehow. And don't get me wrong, people send me music all the time, and I listen to their demos, and if I've got time, I'll feed back on it, and you know, maybe give some constructive criticism, or see if I can suggest labels that might be interested, or just say like, yeah man, this is a great tune. But there's a real fine line, I think, between it just being an organic kind of mutual respect for what each other are doing, and coming across as being like
spam.
A bit too in your face. Yeah, exactly spam and being in your face. And I think you got to appreciate that these labels that are ignoring your tracks, it's not because they're mean, it's because they're getting tons of tracks from all over the place, and they're probably really busy with like 2 people in the office or 3 people, not even in the office, trying to run a label. And quite often these labels that seem like they might be really big organization, it's just a few people working their asses off trying to make it happen. So you know, don't be too hard on them if they don't get back to you. Also, your favorite DJs and producers, don't be too hard on them if they don't get back to you. But at the same time, like you say, if you can have a chat after a show, or you meet someone in a bar, or just connect with people online in a very organic, kind of respectful way, then that can be really awesome, and you can make some amazing connections from doing that.
I totally agree. And that's sort of the bummer with this quarantine, because like you said, all the shows are canceled. I think I spent about $500 in concert tickets this year, like buying in advance, and they're all canceled now. So I don't know what to do. It's weird, but I want to lead into something else. Now I see that live streaming is sort of taking the place of these live shows, and you've been doing a lot of streams lately, haven't you?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, and that's been pretty cool actually. In fact, I'm doing one in about half an hour. It's kind of live. I'm actually going to be broadcasting, recording from the Beneath the Surface album party that happened last year. And as I kind of said in the spiel on it, and anyone listening to this, if you go on my YouTube channel, it's still going to be up there after I streamed it. So if you want to watch it back, go ahead. But yeah, I mean, this summer I was really hoping to get out and tour that record a bit more, and I've got this amazing looking audio visual set up with this guy called Bertie. He made these bespoke visuals, and it's all audio reactive, so as I can improvise and work my way through the live set, the visuals react with it. We've got these kind of cool custom built LED pyramid things that sit at the front of the stage that also react, and it all looks really cool. And we're planning to do an event in Berlin and do an event in London, and kind of making some connections to kind of sort some stuff out, and obviously none of that can happen. So I guess the point in doing this thing this evening was like, well, I'm sitting on this recording of the show where it looked and sounded great, so I'm just going to stream that and chat to people on the comments. And yeah, last week I was DJing from my front room. That was for a charity called Last Night a DJ Saved My Life. Pretty cheesy name, but a good cause. Yes. And they're basically raising money for families affected by COVID. And then a couple of weeks before that, I was doing a live stream from the studio, just chatting about how I made one of my tracks. So yeah, it's quite a crazy time in that respect. Obviously, there's nothing like connecting with your fans in real life, but in like the fact we can't do that at the moment, it's really lucky that we have this technology available. And I've been saying to people, it's really strange when you're about to do a live stream, particularly the one in the studio. You feel like you're about to go on stage and do something in front of hundreds of people, which in some respects you are, because yeah, there is an audience of hundreds of people that are watching you do this thing, but you're just in your studio by yourself. And if you're not used to it, that's quite a surreal experience. But yeah, it's cool, man. It's really nice to be able to connect with the fans and engage your audience and kind of give something to people and let people know that we're all here in our own kind of lockdown somewhere. And if me sharing how I made one of my tracks or DJing some tunes to people online kind of inspires them or just cheers them up one evening, then that's wicked.
I think it will. Thank you so much for doing the interview. I don't want to take any of your time because if you have a live stream coming up soon, it's like, oh, this guy's got to prepare. I guess before we go, I just want to ask you about working in film and television. What advice do you have for anyone that wants to pursue that? Or do you think it's sort of, we were talking to Flashbulb a couple of weeks ago. He did like the Dove commercial and some other stuff. Okay. And he was saying it's pretty hard to get into it now these days. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, quite a few people ask me that question. I know a lot of friends of mine are really amazing producers working as artists, and they're all kind of trying to work out how they can get into doing like library music and stuff for TV as a more sort of solid income, particularly when there's no gigs at the moment. And I guess it's hard to advise because I was so lucky with those connections I talked about earlier that were just friends of mine that ended up working in the industry and had this kind of fairly natural network that developed from that. But I suppose my advice would be a good place to start is listen to TV and watch some films. I mean, there's so much amazing content on Netflix and Amazon and Apple TV now. Like, listen to the stuff, think about the kind of music that is making it into these programs, and also for TV adverts, particularly the cooler ones. And then I'd say a good place to start is get a collection of maybe 4 or 5 tracks together that you've made that sound like they could exist in those places, and try and make them fairly coherent as well. You know, make them energetic and dramatic, or dark and emotive, or cinematic, or whatever. Make them kind of coherent, or if you want to do a few different collections, demonstrate that you're capable of making the sound in a very professional way, and then contact some libraries and send it off to them. That's, I think, a good place to start. In terms of getting bespoke work, I don't really know how you necessarily get into that these days, but I know a lot of library companies are sort of publishers in their own right, and sometimes publishers get to do bespoke work as well. So, you know, once you kind of get in there and that first step of the ladder, as it were, then that can open up some doors to some other possibilities. Personally, for me, I mean, the Ninja Tune have got some amazing connections, so I'm lucky in the sense that they publish me as an artist, but I also get to do bespoke stuff. Some of it's really cool, some of it is really uncool, but it's interesting, man. It's so varied. I did an advert recently for Aero Chocolate, and I got to work with a full like 20-piece big band with some of the top session players in the country. And
nice.
I'm sure having heard my music, you'll realise that it's pretty far removed from big band, but my experience as a jazz guitarist and from having played jazz meant that I kind of, you know, I've got an ear for composing in different styles, particularly jazz, so I was able to kind of turn my hand to that. And I love doing stuff like that. You know, it all feeds into my skills as a producer, even if I don't realize it. Doing a bit of orchestral work, maybe doing a bit of scoring for, in fact I'm working on an advert at the moment for another big chocolate brand, and they wanted some like real kind of Netflixy cinematic sounding kind of building orchestral stuff to kind of really go with what's on the screen. And it just puts you into a different zone, and it keeps things fresh, and it forces you to sort of learn skills that maybe you wouldn't otherwise, or go in directions you wouldn't necessarily kind of go in. And you know, all the music you're making, whatever style it is, it's all feeding into your skills as a producer, and you're always learning something from it. So it can be really fulfilling. But I guess, yeah, going back to the advice thing, like, don't be afraid to try out different styles that you're not used to. And you know, if you've never made an orchestral track before, download some string packs, try and some orchestral packs, and try and write some orchestral stuff. Listen to some stuff that's already out there. Listen to the stuff that's being used in films, and think about how they made it. Think about the harmonies they've used and the rhythms, and you know, see if you can come up with something in that style. Similarly, if you've never produced drum and bass or house, you know, give it a go and push yourself in that style. And it can be really interesting in your growth as a musician to try out different things that you're not used to, and see what you can come up with.
Alex, thank you so much for your time. This has been a really good interview. And before we go, is there anything you want to plug? Your website, your stream? What's your stream address?
So that's going to be, I'm broadcasting on YouTube, so just check out my YouTube channel, Alex Banks. And yeah, I mean, you can find me on all the socials. The tag I usually use is Alex Banks Music, or just go to alexbanksmusic.co.uk, and you can find links to all my releases on there. And yeah, you know, give me a follow on Facebook or Instagram, and or sign up to the mailing list, and yeah, we'll have some exciting news coming up soon about forthcoming releases.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and stay safe during the quarantine.
Thanks a lot, man. Great to chat to you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, take care. Bye.